This has been going on now for weeks and weeks and weeks.
1 week ago, a rocket attack in northern Iraq killed a U.S. military contractor. The Americans blame the Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah brigades. 2 days later, the U.S. launched multiple airstrikes at targets in Iraq and Syria, killing at least 25 fighters. The next day, Hezbollah brigades denied responsibility and vowed to retaliate. Then on New Year's Eve, hundreds of Iraqis stormed the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad. Among them, two powerful Iranian-backed militant leaders. Thousands of U.S. troops were placed on standby. And then last night, that massive escalation. A U.S. drone strike outside the Baghdad International Airport, killing General Qassem Soleimani as the puppet master of Iran's proxy forces throughout the Middle East. Soleimani was seen as second in power only to the Ayatollah himself. So all of this has raised anxiety and questions about what might happen next, and we're going to tackle that right now. Joining us, Janice Stein of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, Kaveh Shahruz, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and from Waterloo, where she teaches at the University of Waterloo, Besma Momani. Janice, let's start with what I think is a key question for a lot of people tonight, which is any of this moving us closer towards war?
I certainly don't think we're going to see an all-out war between Iran and the United States, which is what is raising anxiety. There is a likelihood that there will be some further escalation. I think everyone here is aware, particularly in Iran, of how dangerous a rapid jump up the ladder is. And so, I do not think we will see an all-out war between these two countries.
Kaveh?
I actually entirely agree with that. I think, there's a lot of heated rhetoric nowadays, and Iran's leaders have to bluff and bluster a little bit, and they have to retaliate in some way, and we can certainly discuss what that retaliation would look like. But I think the Iranians recognize that, in any sort of direct combat with the Americans, they would not be able to hold on to power very long, and I think they're primarily interested in preserving their power. And I get the impression that even the Americans, the Trump administration is not interested in war. It's not very domestically popular in an election year, particularly.
So, Besma, let's bring you in on that. If not war, then what might retaliation look like?
Well, I think we're going to see the Iranians possibly using its proxy forces throughout the region. It will want to, I think, attack probably Western interests, particularly commercial ones. Cyber warfare is not off the table. That is something that the Iranians have been perfecting over the years. So I think there's a lot of possibilities out there. And make no mistake, I think the Iranian hardliners do want to avenge the death of Soleimani. One really can't underestimate how valuable he was to the Iranian enterprise. So I think it's going to be a rough road ahead for many people in the region in particular, who are frankly going to be caught in the crossfires of both the Americans and the Iranians going after each other after this.
Kaveh?
I think that's right. I think the Iranians have every incentive to retaliate in some way to save face. You will see their proxies do certain things. You will see cyber warfare, likely terrorist attacks, perhaps. But at the end of the day, I think they will have to contain it in some way because, as I mentioned earlier, they can't engage in direct warfare. It's asymmetric warfare that they might be able to succeed in. So,
Janice, I think some people might have been relieved when they heard you say that there was unlikely to be actual war. But then now, we hear about this potentially rough road ahead. I mean, do you feel there'll be retaliation?
Yes, there will be some things, certainly, although I think there's a risk that we over-exaggerate Soleimani's importance. He's a divisive figure inside. His real ties are to the militias that he built outside Iran. But I think the kind of retaliation we're going to see, it's going to be very calibrated. We've already had, an attack on a tanker. We've had attack on bases. We'll see some of that, but that's a far cry from saying this is a war that is going to engulf the whole area. I just don't think that's going to happen.
Okay, speaking of the area, I'm going to ask each of you this. A country that you think we should be looking at in terms of a potential target of retaliation, or Besma, where things might happen next. What spot would you focus on?
Well, I'm most concerned about Iraq and Lebanon because they've really been the site of where the Iranian regime has most meddled in the region and has been most able to use proxy forces for its purposes. And I think what the Iraqis are very afraid of is indeed this is going to embolden their hardliners. This is going to potentially make a parliament in favor of asking the U.S. forces to leave. One thing that I've been watching for several months now is both Iraq and Lebanon have had these protesters and demonstrators calling for the end of Iranian meddling. And unfortunately, I think what you're going to see is, in fact, the Iranians make it more, frankly, impossible for those protesters to be heard. They've already captured the narrative in the past 24 hours, obviously, and I think they're just going to make very fragile democratic politics in those countries even more problematic and really get all of their proxy forces in high gear to disrupt life for the average Lebanese and Iraqi.
Janice, we talked a little bit about the type of retaliation, what that might look like. Let's do it through this geographic lens. What country will you be looking at?
Well, I know a lot of people are, and Besma just mentioned this, are looking at Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israel. Here, too, I'm going to sound an optimistic note. Hezbollah has a lot of experience with Israel and Israel with Hezbollah. And both of them understand how easy it is to go up that ladder. I very much doubt that Hezbollah will avenge Soleimani's death by provoking an all-out war with Israel. So I actually don't think that's going to be the primary site of retaliation, much more likely in Iraq, where it's harder to control these popular mobilization forces.
And you want to look a little further afield.
Yeah, not as a site of reprisal, perhaps, but as a country to watch. I think Russia is a really important player in this region. So Russia has a very direct impact on what happens on the ground in Syria, where Soleimani was very, very active and the Iranian regime is very active. And Russia has a lot of influence over what the Iranian regime does. So if they want to escalate things, I mean, I think they have that kind of influence to call for Iran to escalate. If they want to de-escalate, they can turn down the heat a little bit.
Besma, with Soleimani gone here, I'm not sure how the succession of power works within his organization. Can he be easily replaced, or does this make a big difference to his organization?
Well, he's already been replaced. The replacement's been announced. I think the important thing to point out here, though, is that I do think Soleimani is unique. Again, no one in the region, well, very few people in the region are really shedding honest tears for this man. There's a lot of blood on his hands. But the reality is he was seen as a folk hero by some. He was seen as a military genius by others, even amongst many of the people that we today look at, like Assad's regime and others who we despise. But the reality is he was well respected in some circles. So, you know, I don't think Soleimani is easily replaced at that level of folk heroism and intellect, but certainly I don't think the IRGC and the entire Iranian Revolutionary Guard is going to stop its activities throughout the region. This is not the end of Iran's nefarious activities throughout the region. Quite the contrary, we're going to see it very much escalate.
One last question that I'll put to each of you, and in the immediate aftermath of the news of the airstrike, you know, I went to Twitter and I saw this very polarized reaction, particularly from the United States. Was this the right thing to do? What, you know, so I ask you guys this question, not through a political lens, but being analysts. And Janice, I'll begin with you.
You know, Obama almost did it, Ian, and then pulled back at the last moment. So Soleimani has been in the line of sight for a while. You only know whether this is the right thing to do. We will only know months and months after the fact. But there is one risk here. Soleimani's primary value was he could control these proxy forces because he built them. He had personal relationships. He knew everybody, and they were loyal. I think there's no question it's going to be more difficult for the Iranian military to control these forces over these next several months.
I think opinion, as you mentioned, seems to be very divided. I am always very reluctant to say anything positive about Donald Trump, but I think what the Trump administration's figured out is that you know, the problem is not just Soleimani, but the IRGC and the Iranian regime as a whole. And I think what I hope that Trump administration and the rest of the democratic world realizes that what they have to do is they actually have to help Iranian people ultimately topple this regime. Because so long as this theocratic regime stays in place, so long as they continue their nefarious activities, you're going to see this kind of export of terrorism, you're going to see repression, you're going to see brutality, and fundamentally the solution to all this is a new democratic secular regime that's brought about by the Iranian people. And
Besma, the last minute to you.
Look, I think there's going to be short-term gratification in many quarters, even in the Middle East. Again, the effect Soleimani has had on the region is a negative one in so many ways. But the unintended consequences of what this might lead to, the potential snowballing of events that are disastrous for the region and for many, many civilians, history will tell, of course, and what this means to international law and other sort of liberal principles that we value is something to be debated. But of course, I'm not shedding any tears over his death.
Smart, measured analysis from all three of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.